and then come back, and by Sunday morning we're here and we're having church in it again. And I just think the Lord's always pleased when we make room in our church, in our homes, in our lives for other people and for the things that they need and helping them out. So did you want to give us a little bit of an update on how much you raised and how things went?
She lost her voice because she talked to everybody all day.
Oh, okay, I get that.
Their ultimate goal was $5,300, and they made $4,860.
Oh, wow, very nice. Nice work. And you had enough, what, we have about 90 people maybe come through yesterday as part, and people from throughout the community. It was a lot of fun. We had a great time. So, and when it's the first time I'd ever been to a chili cook-off. I really didn't know how it went. So I went to my first pot of chili, and they gave me this, I don't know, like a 2-ounce cup or 3-ounce cup and a little bit of a ladle of stuff in there. I'm like, okay, that's not a lot of stuff right there. But by the time I made it around to all the places, that was probably like 2 bowls of chili right there. So it was just fine. And thank you to all those who helped and pitched in and just made that an important event. So do want to let you know about our Grief Share ministry, which is going to be getting started up here in March. So Sissy, fill us in if you would please on what that is going to be like, when and where and how.
In the cafe, starting March 11th through June 4th, we have from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. We have a light soup dinner to start us off. And if you want to register, you can go to griefshare.org and find my church and just put in Murphy's and register.
Okay.
Church. And if you don't register, that's fine. The benefit of registering is as we get each video session, if there's one you miss, you can watch that particular one at home now.
Oh, that's a nice feature now they've added. Yeah, that's great.
That's the benefit of registering.
Yeah. Okay. And then Monday, what's going on Monday?
I guess
That's tomorrow.
tomorrow I'm going to be in the cafe from 11 to about 1 doing a presentation and just for those who want to come and have more details, hear more about the ladies that we minister to and have a time of question and answer. Sometimes I'll be talking about stuff really, really fast and you guys are like, wait a minute. So we'll be doing that. We'll have some food and just a nice time of fellowship.
All right. Time to little update on on your adventures in Thailand and the work you got to do there. So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Sometimes as I go through this book, I'm going, Lord, why did you send me into 1 Corinthians? There are some challenging passages in this book, and partly one of the things that's challenging is there was a previous letter that Paul wrote that he sometimes refers to, and we don't have a copy of that letter. So there's parts of this communication that maybe we don't have all the aspects of, right, that he refers to. Secondly, we are not Corinthians. We're not familiar with the environment in Corinth, with the culture in Corinth, what that looked like, what the standards were. It was a mixed city. It was really a place where East and West met together. There was a lot of idol worship going on, and very structured and very much a part of fabric of the society. Religion wasn't something that the Greeks pushed off to the side. It was really central in their way of thinking. So all of that, the religious aspect was not a part. It wasn't like, okay, 20% of the people there are religious. People actually felt better about adding more gods than less to make sure that they had the whole spectrum covered as much as they could. So we're not really familiar with even that kind of thinking, with the Greek thinking of knowledge and wisdom and how that elevated people, or in their minds elevated people. So sometimes it's a little challenging to read these passages. And interestingly, as I went through and looked at the next 15 verses that we're going to look at, and starting in chapter 11, we're going to start in the second verse because the first verse kind of concludes chapter 10, is this section on hair length for men, head coverings for women. How does that fit today? Where do we go with that? And first of all, let me just say that I doubt any of you ladies that are hatless coming in this morning thought to yourself, well, I'll show them. right? It's like it's not something, having a hat on or having a head covering is not something we in our culture associate with a certain attitude or lifestyle or choices or rebellion. It's just something that is just part of it. It's like you wear it, you don't wear it. It's kind of like up to you. And so I think what I love to look for, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is what's Paul's moral lesson in this, and can we sort through some of this? So I'm just going to read it. I'm not going to try to explain every aspect as we go through. I'm just going to read the passage, and then I'm going to reflect on it a bit, referring back to some of the portions of that. So 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 2. Paul is saying, this is the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Corinth, a church that he has planted, that he has helped get growing. He has started it in a Jewish synagogue there in the city, and it has grown to include now Jews and Gentiles, that is, non-Jewish believers in Christ. He goes on in verse 2, he says, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings just as I passed them on to you. Again, there was a previous letter. Paul had done previous work there. We're not sure exactly what those teachings looked like. He said, now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. And every woman, who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. And if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut or shaved off, she should just cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, and because of the angels, again, let's just throw that in there, Paul, so we can wonder what that means. The woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. And he concludes his argument there. Anybody want to make real sense of that? Want to try to apply that into today's setting or how that fits in? Believe me, I've seen all kinds of applications of that. I would have you remember our context. As I said, some things we know about life in first century Corinth, some things we don't. Some things we kind of guess at. Archaeologists do their best to unearth what they can and put dates on things and times on things, but we don't know all about that. But we know that this probably includes some references to the way things were at the time. We don't know exactly what the significance of hairstyles or length of hair was in that setting, what moral implications there were by the length of somebody's hair. We live in a world today, in a society, where most of these visible attributes are not taken so strongly. However, I will say that having lived a number of years and spent a number of years in church and in various churches and different settings, I've seen so many different ways that this idea applies. And some of you, men and myself, I remember when I was just a boy, I told my dad I wanted my hair like Ringo Starr. You remember, some of you remember the Beatles, right? Now look at that long-haired, shaggy group of hippies right there. Isn't that funny? You know what my dad's response was? With his buzz cut, right? You know what his response was? Oh, that's fine, but where are you going to live? So this was rebellious in a sense, right? This was groundbreaking back in the 60s. And I remember my pastor, who I came into his church in the early 70s, he had hair about that length, a little longer, and he was known as a long-haired preacher. Okay, isn't that odd? I mean, many of your parents would go today, I'd love it if my kids would cut their hair like that. That'd be great, right? It's like, so anyway, you can take that down. I don't want people to constantly be thinking about, Hey Jude or whatever else is going on in their heads. We don't have a clear idea of what that typical man's haircut looked like in that setting. In fact, most of the time when we see pictures of biblical settings around Jerusalem, Israel, we see men with longer hair, right? We know even in the Old Testament there were people who would take a Nazirite vow in which they would allow their hair to grow out, and that was part of their vow. We know in the story of Samson, his strength was taken. So, one of those questions is, what is meant by long? Exactly what is that? I mean, to my dad, that was long hair, right? That would have been unacceptable and would have put me on the outside looking in. Also, it could be that male prostitutes at the time, we know that there was a lot of prostitution going on in Corinth. We know that the sexual mores were very loose. We know that it was just a built-in part of the economy there. I know Sissy was sharing with us about the human trafficking taking place in Pattaya there in Thailand, but Corinth was a very similar type of city where that was just very available. And oftentimes there were men of stature or station in life or wealth who would take advantage of other men or who would pay for that, and that oftentimes it's possible that long hair was a sign of being a part of that, and more an argument in regard to cross-dressing, which we also see the Old Testament outlawing, the sense that men were dressing as women or women trying. So is he just addressing that? But then he goes on to talk about more. So we could see where maybe it's just addressing that aspect. But there was a time in both European and American culture where it was considered bad form for a man to be in public without a hat of some sort. There was just a time where you did not leave your house without a hat on as a man. And then when you went in to church or some other place, the hat left, right? Places to hang your hats, and you went in, and that was just considered part of the standard. Whether that was a standard there in Corinth or whether it was men not having their heads covered or what it meant if a person had their head covered, we don't know. But Paul's not necessarily just making an argument from culture. He's talking about this aspect of men really fulfilling that purpose of standing before God and honoring God with their heads uncovered and not praying with their heads covered. Nowadays, it's quite common to see men hats on, hats off, inside, outside, wherever. It's just, but at that time, or even as I grew up, it was just there were certain standards that you kind of held to. My dad would have elbowed me if I had a hat on inside. He would take that off. It's just what we were raised with. But so. On the topics of head coverings for women, now I'm going to wade into it just a little bit here. It can become even more challenging to arrive at a consensus. Let's talk about hair length first of all. Been around church for a long time. Some of you have been around church for a long time. You know that this scripture has been applied to everything from, a woman's hair needs to be at least longer than most men's. That would be considered right, because otherwise she's trying to look like a man. There's that. To, in some denominations and some traditions, at least shoulder length. Right? If it's not shoulder length, it's not long enough, that's too short a hair for women. In some traditions, the hair would be seldom or never cut. You might see women who, if they were to allow their hair down, it would be clear to the floor. That was the tradition. It was like this was their glory, this was their honor. I've seen and worked with women, Christian women, in all those traditions, right? And they practice what they believe, and I have a great respect for the fact that they see that as a show of respect and of submission before God. I doubt many of you have been brought up in that tradition. Right? It's just not something, again, you didn't walk in here, ladies, without a hat on thinking, I'll show them. I'll set the new standard. When it comes to head coverings for women, also runs the gamut. I've seen everything from from hair being enough of a covering, just a woman's hair. When I've had conversations with people about, what do you believe about head coverings? We have that conversation. Well, to them, I said, well, I don't see your ladies. Well, as long as they have long hair, as long as they have hair, that's their head is covered. So, but then others would be that even a full head of hair would not be sufficient and would require some other form of covering, partly possibly for the angels that might be there, possibly angels to mean church leaders who might be overlooking the congregation, so women should have their head covering. Some believe head covering is necessary anytime a woman is in public. Some believe head covering should be worn at all times because they believe that the reference to angels is not just church leaders, but the angels who are around all the time, right? And they're not just hanging out at church. As far as style goes, it ranges from a simple band. I've seen just a simple band across the top of the head as head covering. That's enough. In some traditions, just even almost like a doily, just placed on top of the head. A friend of mine who was raised a very traditional Catholic, as we went to prayer one time in a Bible study, she just put her hand on top of her head. Like this is covering, because we're praying. So simple band across the head to a plain scarf. A full scarf that to cover the head. Many women still today, many parts of the world, that's part of the tradition, part of their normal garb that they would wear. And then in different church traditions, how fancy that scarf would be of some question, right? Whether it should be a single color, whether it could be print, whether it could be bright colors or needed to be a sedated color. I've seen all of that brought up. Some conclude that a very uniform style of bonnet or coverlet is what is called for. We see some Christian traditions where you'll see the women wear a very standardized head covering, perhaps with their hair gathered underneath it and covering their heads, and that's what's considered. Some more modern takes on this instruction might include hats that are very colorful and stylish. How many of you remember the old movie, The Easter Parade? In my Easter bonnet, right? With all that would be, I'm going to church, it's Easter, Easter bonnet, nice hat, and lots of show built into that. Others would shun that tradition, say that's not really a head covering, that's a head decoration. And do you hear what I'm saying? You could land anywhere in that zone in trying to fulfill the intent of this passage. And believe me, I have sat down with people in all ranges of that to have that conversation most of the time because they're concerned that I'm not talking enough about that or not bringing that up enough. And I remember we had a family that was at our church for a time that had come from a completely kind of different country setting background, and they had certain practices, and head covering was one of those. The women, even the girls, young girls, head coverings, scarves, basically at all times, rather plain. And he would ask me, he said, why is it that your ladies, the women here at the church, don't wear head coverings, And I told him one time, I said, I could maybe get all of them to put something on their heads, but I said, I think the message of that, more importantly, is the submission that we have before God. You know what? The old saying, I'm sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. It's like I may look like I have a certain attitude because of the way I'm dressed or the way I come across, but in reality inside, I am just rebelling against everything that's going on, right? We can kind of push people into that mode, and sometimes that's what we see. And then, of course, Paul concludes the matter by saying, if anyone wants to be contentious about this, what? About what exactly, right? Exactly what practice? Contentious about headscarf, contentious about a band, contentious about hair length. What is it? We don't have any other practice, nor do the churches of God. I'm left going, what practice exactly are we talking about? Am I making sense to you? I'd like to take a look at something that as I read the scriptures, and especially as I come to a passage like this, there's two things to tempt me. One is just to kind of scrap it. Just say, okay, that was for then. Let's move on to now, right? But there are nuggets in this of moral instruction that we can take from that and kind of build from that and think about how does that affect me as I am living out my life today. The Bible, Old and New Testaments both, instructs women to be submitted to their husbands, right? You'll get no argument from me on that point. That is biblical. However, it could be said that it's easier for a man not to argue about that point than it is for a woman. This idea of submission, though, is what kind of comes in. And this, I often have this conversation with couples as they're preparing for marriage or as they're trying to figure out what is this, because they know this is an aspect particularly of Christian marriage, and what is that structure. And again, biblically, there's no question that God has put in place this structure where a man is the head of his house, a wife is submitted to that. But what comes into question sometimes, and I think what becomes a wrong image, is what does submission mean? What exactly does that look like in submission? Because guaranteed, if all you're looking for is someone who just does everything you tell them to do, you could get a slave for that. You can hire somebody to do that. But if you're really looking for a partner in life that is going to have your best interests at heart, you want somebody who knows how to lead from the bottom. We call that leading up. I've worked in enough organizations at times to work with somebody who's perhaps an executive director or somebody who's running that organization, and they have their hands on their feet on the ground all the time. They got their hands in the mix. They know what's going on. They've studied this. Perhaps they've even got advanced degrees in what they're doing. And oftentimes they're surrounded by a board of people who make it their business once a month to think about this process. And that person has to learn kind of how to lead up. That is, how do I help instruct these people that to accomplish the purpose that God has for them? In Ephesians, Paul begins his teaching on husbands and wives by saying, submit to one another out of a reverence for Christ. Isn't it just before he says, wives, submit to your husbands, just before he instructs husbands to love their wives, what does he open it with? Submit to each other. Well, how does that work? If we're supposed to submit to each other, how does that work? Who's in charge? How does that function? In verses 11 and 12 of today's passage, Paul balances the concept of submission based on gender with this statement. Because they're saying, well, shouldn't this be the husband is the head, the wife, she's showing submission. But he says in verses 11 and 12, he says, in the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. In other words, they're thinking, well, man came first, then woman. He said, but in the Lord, think about it for a minute. Yes, woman came from man. However, man is born of a woman. There's this interdependence that goes on in that relationship. It's not just top down, we don't need you, you can step aside. It's like, I don't care how big a man you are, you had a mother at some point, right? And she carried you around, and she took care of you, and she saw to it that you made it as far as you did. And for you to step back and think, wow, she must not be very important to this function, is to way underestimate God's actual plan here. So remembering our theme for 2025, every day a feast. Every day a feast. So when I go through a passage like this, I'm like, Lord, where's the feast in this, right? Where's the lesson, the meat that I can take away from this as a person when I'm trying, rather than debating on, is this hair too long? I don't know. Should I get it cut more? What should that look like? Rather than thinking about that, or even more likely, judging other people based on that, right? It's easier for me to judge other people's outlook or outfit or the way they look or come across than it is for often to judge my own. When God calls us to submission, he doesn't just call us to follow instructions or do as you're told or be the second in command in a sense and somebody else is in command. Not necessarily their every whim or desire. Sorry, men, that's not really how this works. If you've tried that and it's not working for you, maybe you'll figure out why now. Thinking about the centrality of identity and purpose as we've gone through this, thinking about who we are, what we are called to do. How can I submit the identity God has given me That is, when I think about that, that is all that makes up who I am. That is my age, my experience in life, things that I'm good at, things that I'm not good at, my preferences, my personality, my just every aspect of that, my given gender. How do I submit all of that to God's purpose? How do I say, God, this is all for you? So in this passage, part of what Paul's talking about is this head covering is kind of an indicator that I am submitted to what God has for me. But beyond that, I like to think a little deeper. How do I demonstrate my submission to God's purpose in my life with every aspect of my life? With everything that I am, every bit of who I am, all that he's given me, all that he's made me to be, all that I bring to bear in that. How do I do that not only to serve his purpose, but how do I do that to serve the purposes in the lives of others? His purpose in the lives of others. I like to say, I believe that biblically, even friendship is a form of covenant, right? In covenant relationship, there's something committed about how we are going to look at each other from that point forward. In friendship is a sort of covenant where we have whether it's in biblically you might have broken bread together, or when we see David and Jonathan, they've made this commitment to one another where they've actually said, hey, look, I'll always watch your back, you'll always watch mine, we will always be friends, we will always watch out for each other. Even though they ended up on different sides at times in battles, yet they still had this commitment of friendship, covenant. Marriage is a covenant. Right? I mean, don't marry somebody unless it's your intention to watch out for their best interests. Don't do it. If you're getting into it because of your best interests being served, that's not covenant. That's just contract. I'm here to get what I need. You're going to get what you need. That's a negotiation. But covenant is something where we step in with our whole selves. As we come into covenant with God, not only has he said, I'm going to sacrifice my son to save you and to deliver you, but I'm also going to receive your gift of all that you are, mess that you are, trouble that you have, whatever is going on. I'm going to take that and I'm going to turn it into something beautiful that serves my purposes. And I'm even going to use you to serve my purpose in the lives of others. So I like to tell people, you know how to, the way to be a friend, the people who are truly friends in your life, well, we go through life with a lot of friends that might have common interests or things that we do, but look for the people who are committed to serving God's purpose in your life. They might tell you what you don't want to hear. They might challenge you in an area where you didn't really want to be challenged. They might remind you of something that you promised that you would do and you kind of forgot. They will be people who prompt you toward being the best that God has called you to be. That's a friend. That's a covenant friend. In the same way, husbands and wives are in a covenant where it's my task as a husband to help Tina fulfill God's purpose for her life. That's my challenge, right? That's what I want to be able to help her do. In the same way, she has that same commitment to help me fulfill the purpose that God has for me. Remember last week I said, not only have we completed 49 years of marriage, but now God spoke to me and said, okay, Bart, what does a husband with 49 years of experience look like? What do you bring to the table after 49 years that you maybe didn't have after 1 or 2? What's different about that? We should be growing in grace, growing in what God has given us so that we can be even more useful in the kingdom. And that whether I could put a hat on or take a hat off, I can cut my hair short or I can let it grow long, but that's not going to change my effectiveness in the kingdom. A little passage that I read from 2 Peter this morning talks about growing in these graces, right, of knowledge and of love and of brotherly kindness, growing in those so that we might be what? Effective. And we avoid being ineffective for God. God didn't just call you to be saved and to skate through and avoid punishment. That's awesome that that's a part of that covenant. But part of that covenant is he said, I'm going to also help you become effective at what I've called you to do. I think so often people understand their salvation. They understand that aspect of their identity, but they forget that along with that identity, God has called you to be a kingdom of priests, right? Serving and worshiping and carrying forward this. Messengers, people who are ambassadors for Christ. God is making his appeal to the world through us. That means that every aspect of my life should be about serving God's purpose and about serving God's purpose in the lives of others. Those should be the two things that mark out my life. In verse 3, Paul states, the head of Christ is God. Think about that for just a minute. Christ so far above us, right? So far above us. And he says, okay, husbands, wives, you're under here. He says the man is under Christ. Well, man, we are way under Christ. Right? We're way under him, right? We get that concept that, yeah, it's much better if he's in charge than if I'm in charge. It's just going to work out better that way. But what's interesting is he said, here is Christ and God, speaking of the Son and the Father. Well, we know as we look at the Scripture that you can't slip a piece of paper between the Son and the Father when it comes to equality. They are of the same substance. They are both part of the Godhead. There's no difference in their quality, no difference in their value. One is not better than the other. One's not smarter than the other. One is not set above the other. And oftentimes in our world, we think in terms of, well, if somebody's in charge, they must be better than me. Remember that, what I was telling you about some organizations? They might have a person who runs that organization who if you're on the board of an organization, you better hope you've hired somebody that's better at running it than you would be, right? You really you're going to be overseeing them in a sense and basically serving them so that their purpose gets served in that organization. Same way at home. You might say, guys, if you think you're smarter than your wives, oh my goodness, you haven't been married long enough, okay? You're going to find that there are things that they see and things that they pick up that you're going to miss. And when you fail to listen because you think you've got to be better to be in charge, no. You're going to learn to listen, and that's going to help you do what needs to be done. That's going to help you fulfill your purpose. If your purpose is just being the boss, that's not much purpose. But if you see the bigger picture of what you're supposed to do, and you see how that rolls out, then you get some sense that here's the Father, here's the Son, there's no distance between them, but they serve different purposes. And yet the Son submits himself to the Father in doing that. Philippians 2, 6-8, I love this, that Paul speaks of Christ, who being in very nature himself God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. Do you see that? I mean, I'm seeing it right here. I don't know if you're seeing it, but I'm seeing it. He made himself nothing. He took on the very nature of a servant, being made even in human likeness. What a downgrade that was for Jesus. I mean, not only did he get downgraded to human form, like be able to come as maybe a king or something, reigning over some powerful empire. Instead, he comes as a baby, born in a stable. That's the degree to which he will go. That is the length of submission that he will put forth in order to serve God's purpose in your life. That's the model we have. Go that far. Change everything about me. Reduce everything about me. If I get to serve your purpose, God, that's all I'm looking for. The psalmist said, oh, I just want to be a doorkeeper in your house, God. That satisfies me. Oh, you don't want to be in charge of the treasury? Nope, let somebody else do that. I'll just take care of the door. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself even further and became obedient even to death. Even submitting himself to a kangaroo court, submitting himself to man's judgment, he submitted himself even to the point of death to serve what? His purpose? No, the Father's purpose and his purpose in us. That's what he came for. Even a death on a cross. Do you begin to see that submission is not some negative thing? It's actually an incredible opportunity. It helps define our purpose for us. I love knowing, who do I answer to? Who am I accountable to? It helps me know, how do I help them then accomplish their purpose that God has given them? How do I come alongside whoever it might be and help them with that? When we're doing Vacation Bible School, whoever's running Vacation Bible School, and it's generally not me, they're my boss that week. What do you need? How do I get that for you? What can I help you with? What do you need? Where do you need me to fill in? What can I take care of for you? When we were having the chili cook-off here yesterday, Addie and Olivia, those were my bosses. What do you guys need? What do I need to find for you? What do I need to get? How can I help you accomplish the purpose that you have so that you're accomplishing God's purpose in your life? That's the beauty of submission. Jesus never saw submission to the Father as somehow reducing his position. He was simply fulfilling the purpose that God had for him. And when it came to wearing something on his head, a crown of thorns would do. A crown of thorns would do. When it came to dressing up, he hung on a cross barely wearing anything. They threw a purple robe on him just to mock him for his position as king. Willingly he did all of that to submit to us, for us, and for our purpose. My question to you would be, to myself, what are the signs or evidence of my submission to God's purpose for me? Like I told my friend Lucian, Lucian, we could get hats for all the ladies in our church, but it wouldn't fix our hearts. We could be satisfied and go, look at that, we got them all covered. But you know what touches me much more is when I see them going out of their way to help somebody else. When I see somebody teaching a Sunday school class and helping a child figure out their identity and their purpose in Christ. When I see one of them just coming along, what needs done? How do we get that done? I so appreciate that so often in this church that I run into when there's an event or something going on. Often we don't have a list of, okay, this is the crew on cleanup, or this is the crew on that. People just stick around and go, what needs to be done? Let's get it done. Let's accomplish it, right? We don't get hung up on what somebody's wearing or what they have on or what their hair length is. It just doesn't really matter. I mean, there are times when I'm in a suit and tie because that's how I'm accomplishing the purpose God has for me that day. Then there are times when you're going to see me with an apron on because that's how I'm accomplishing God's purpose for me that day. That's how I'm helping him accomplish his purpose in the lives of others. There are times when you're going to see me in the store, you're not going to recognize me. I'm in jeans, t-shirt, old bill cap. I'm working on something, getting something. And so many times I pass people, I say, oh, hi, how you doing? They're kind of like, whoa, who is this person? It doesn't matter. But let me ask you, what are the signs? What are the symbols? What are the indicators of your submission to God's purpose in your life? We talked about those in Jesus' life. What are they in your life? How does that unfold for you? Is it getting up earlier so that you can be of more help to somebody? Is it making sure that you're taking time to pray so that you're covering the bases for your children, for your husband, for your church, for your community? How are you wearing that hat of submission to the place God has you and the point of service that you are in? What does that look like? Each of us, I think, has to answer that. It's too easy to put on a hat, too easy to let your hair grow or cut it off. It's different to think about, how do I step into this role of Christ? See the feast that's in this? The feast is to think about submission. What does that look like in my life? And then secondly, what are the signs that you are helping others to fulfill their purpose? How are you coming alongside others and helping them in that? When you see somebody who's stumbling along, how do you come along and build them up? What does that look like for you? Oh, it'd be too easy to just put on the right clothes. It'd be too easy to just dress up the right way or cut my hair in a certain way, whatever it might. It'd just be too easy. But what should the Christian's attitude and lifestyle look like if we are truly in covenant with Christ and truly in covenant with those around us, serving the purposes of God in their lives? That's the question I want to leave you with this morning. That's the one I want you to try to answer this next week. Would you bow your heads with me? Father, I thank you that you sent Jesus, and I thank you that he came. I thank you that he submitted himself to you. He didn't take submission as a step down. He didn't take it as an aside. He didn't get offended by the fact that you chose him for that task. Instead, he took it as an honor, looking forward to the glory that would be revealed through that work. Father, I pray for those right now who are struggling to be submitted wherever they are, struggling to be submitted to their role as a parent, submitted to their role as a spouse, a husband or a wife, maybe submitted at work, submitted in ministry, whatever it might be. Father, I ask you to just fulfill your purpose in them, to help them put on the head covering if it takes it, begin to bring forth those signs of obedience to you in everything that they do, whether it's in their attitude, in their speech. Maybe they've just been talking out the side of their mouth a little bit frustrated or angry. Lord, I ask you to bless them and help them to just see your example, to look forward to serving your purpose in the lives of others. We ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Amen. God bless you all, and pray you have a good rest of your week.